Welcome back to our study on apologetics. During our first lesson, we discussed what apologetics is and gave some reasons why we should carry out the apologetic task. As we go forward, we're going to put ourselves into the shoes of certain occupations or vocations, like a philosopher or an artist or an historian, and ask the question, how would they look at the claims of the Bible that God exists, that Jesus is God's Son and rose from the dead? Today, we'll talk about philosophy. Next time, we'll talk about how a historian would look at the evidence. Then we'll go to a lawyer, a scientist, and we'll end with an artist. So let's start with philosophy. Philosophy, simply put, is the love of wisdom. Truthfully, we're all philosophers. If you think about yourself in the world, well, you're doing philosophy. So as a philosopher, how do we look at the claims that Jesus rose from the dead and that God existed and created this world? How would a philosopher take a look at the evidence? Now, a philosopher is going to talk about a thing called a worldview. A worldview, simply put, is how you view the world. And there are as many worldviews as there are people who have ever lived. We all have our own view of the world. And yet, there are commonalities between these worldviews. In a moment, we're going to talk about four main worldviews that we encounter in the Western world. There are many others, but for our purposes, we'll just talk about those four. Let's explain what a worldview is just a little bit further first. A worldview is an overarching story that explains the world to us. A worldview may have a beginning, it may have the end, in between, it may give us a sense of belonging, it may have a moral code, tells us how to live, it may give us something to inspire to. What is the highest good? What does it mean for a human being to flourish? The first worldview that we'd like to talk about is called theism. Theism states that there is a God and that this God is personal. What do we mean by a personal God? Think of God as a person, not a human being, but a person with a personality. This is a God that can talk to you, a God that can interact. So theism is the belief in a personal God. The second worldview is deism. Deism believes that there is a God, but that this God is impersonal. This God cannot and does not interact with the world. The deist God created this universe, set everything into motion, and let it go, and said goodbye, and never would interact with it again. The third worldview is not technically a worldview, but it's more of a way of thinking. It's called agnosticism. It comes from the Greek word for not having knowledge. So an agnostic would say, I don't know if there is a God or not. I don't know if Jesus rose from the dead or not. Agnosticism tries to live life by not answering those big questions, specifically if God exists or not. The fourth main worldview is naturalism. A naturalist believes that there is only nature. There's only physical things. There isn't a spiritual realm, so there is no God, there is no soul, no spirit, no miracles, no angels, no afterlife. And if you keep pulling that string, there actually is no right or wrong, no love, no courage, no patience, all the things that we use to describe our souls and our interactions with other people who have souls. A naturalist would say, those are just words that we use to describe the biological functions in our body and in our brains. So theism believes in a personal God. Christianity is theistic, but so is Islam and Judaism. Deism believes in an impersonal God. Agnostics ignore the question of whether there is a God or not, and a naturalist believes that there is no God. So when I approach my skeptical friend, I have to understand that he or she has a worldview. And we want to be humble about our own worldview. We certainly don't know everything, and we want to make sure that we are not being arrogant and trying to push our worldview on somebody else. At the same time, we have a few bits of criteria we can use to judge if a worldview is accurate or not, good or not. Let's talk about 5 of them. The first criteria is this worldview coherent? I'll give you an example of incoherence. If I said, why don't you come over to my house and we'll barbecue rainbows, that doesn't make sense. Or if I asked you what's the smell of the color blue, you would understand this is not coherent. So if a worldview is incoherent, that's a check mark against it. The second criteria is the worldview comprehensive? Does it tell me about the beginning and the end? Does it give me a moral code? So maybe, for example, I would look at the naturalistic worldview and I would criticize it by saying, it doesn't really give me a good answer of the beginning. Where did all this stuff come from? And it doesn't have a moral code that I can follow, because there truthfully is no right or wrong. It's just we use those words to describe our society. So I would say it's not comprehensive. The third criteria is it internally consistent. Now, truthfully, we all have our inconsistencies. But if the worldview says that all human beings are created equal and they should be treated equally, and yet in society we're okay with people being judged because of the color of their skin or their gender or something like that, that's inconsistent, and that's a check mark against somebody's worldview. The next criteria is it externally consistent? Are there bits of evidence outside the worldview that can corroborate the worldview? Now, every worldview is going to have things that you can't really prove scientifically. That's just the way it is. We all go by faith in a certain way. But if your worldview believes in the existence of unicorns and unicorns don't exist, that's kind of a check mark against your worldview. Now, the last criteria I think is really important, even though it's not as easily determined. The fifth criteria is, what does the worldview inspire? If a worldview inspires intellectual curiosity and freedom and love and human rights, that seems to me to be a good worldview. But if the worldview inspires hate and violence and injustice, that would not be a very good worldview. Now, there's a caveat here. We have to understand that if somebody abuses a worldview, it doesn't mean that the worldview itself is wrong. Certainly, there are Christians who have done very bad things. That doesn't mean that Christianity is wrong. Just because it abused Christianity doesn't make it wrong. So we can use these criteria to help us understand and to maybe even challenge somebody's worldview and say, is it consistent? Is it coherent? Is it comprehensive? Does it match up with external evidence? And what does it inspire? Before we end, I'd like to talk one more thing about faith and reason. The truth is that we all go by faith. Even the hardest atheist goes by faith. The atheist believes that what they see and hear, the empirical evidence that comes from their senses, is real. We call that natural faith. Even if they can't prove it with certainty, they still go by faith. But then there is the supernatural faith. That is the Holy Spirit coming into our hearts and changing our hearts to trust Jesus. And so your atheist friend, well, he believes too. It's not a question of being a believer or an unbeliever. It's a question of what do you believe? Or better yet, whom do you trust? And I think that's a way to challenge the worldview of maybe your skeptical friends. We all go by faith. The question is, what do we believe? Whom do we trust? Let's take a moment to discuss what a worldview is and maybe even take a look at your own worldviews and compare them to those criteria, and maybe compare them to other worldviews. Welcome back. I hope you had a good discussion about what a worldview is, and perhaps even got into a discussion about your own worldview. You're doing the work of a philosopher. Now let's get into an actual philosophical argument for the existence of God. This is called the Cosmological Argument for the existence of God. Now, before we get to the actual argument, we need to define cosmology and talk about one more thing, and that is causes. Cosmology is just the study of causes, cause and effect. In particular, what caused this universe? Why are we here rather than not here? This is the realm of cosmology. Now, again, before we get to the actual argument, let's talk about what causes are. When philosophers talk about causes, they talk about it in two different ways. The first way is cause and effect. So you imagine like a billiard ball that is hit and hits another billiard ball, and the cause of the hitting the billiard ball then has an effect, this billiard ball going this way. That's simple enough. But when philosophers talk about causes, they also mean descriptors of things. So let's talk about 4 different causes or descriptions to help explain something. So let's imagine that I have a dry erase marker in my hand. Now, when I take this marker and I want to explain its existence to you, I'm going to explain it with 4 causes or 4 descriptors. The first descriptor is the material cause. What is it made of? So imagine this marker, it's made of plastic, it has felt in it, and there's ink, and there's a cap. That's the stuff that it's made of. The second descriptor is the formal cause. What form did this marker take? The form is a writing utensil. A crayon is a writing utensil, but would be made of different material. A pen and a pencil is made of different material, but all of those things are like the marker. It is a writing utensil. So I've told you what it's made of, and I told you the form. The next descriptor is the efficient cause. Now I need to tell you how it got here, how it was made. Well, it has a lot of efficient causes, this marker that I'm showing you. This marker had raw materials that were mined. This marker had somebody who invented it, who designed it, who actually manufactured it. It also has somebody that packaged it up, and the truck driver that drove it to the place, and the person who opened the package and placed that marker into my hand. All of those are efficient causes. I've explained how it was made and how it got here. Now, a lot of people want to stop right there and say we can fully explain things by telling you the material it's made up, what form it takes, and how it was made and how it arrived. But imagine this marker is at a school, and it's right on the sill of a whiteboard. To fully explain the existence of that particular marker, I need to ask one more question, and that's the why question. Why is it here? And the answer, to fully explain the existence of that particular marker, the answer is education. If there was no such thing as education, that particular marker would not exist. This is called the teleological or final cause or descriptor. Think telescope when we think of the word telos from the Greek. I'm going to the end. Telos is the destiny, the goal, the purpose. It answers the why question. When Jesus was dying on the cross, he used a form of this word telos. He said tetelestai, which we translate as, it is finished. His purpose, his goal, his destiny was completed. So to fully explain, for instance, a human being, we need to ask the why question. Not just what we're made of, and what form that we take, or how we got here, our parents, but rather, what is my purpose? Why am I here? Now let's get to the argument, the cosmological argument for the existence of God. Simply put, the cosmological argument goes like this. Everything that exists began to exist, and everything that began to exist had a cause. Because things don't just pop into existence. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Now this has to do with contingency. You didn't just pop into existence, but you're contingent on your parents. And your parents didn't just pop into existence, but they are contingent on your grandparents, and they on your great-grandparents, and so on. But we can't have what we call an infinite regress, and we keep going back from causes to causes to causes to causes. Eventually, most people think we have to have a beginning. We have to have an uncaused cause. So the argument goes like this. The universe began to exist, therefore it has a cause, and now the question is, what is that cause? Well, logically, that cause would have to be pretty powerful. I would think outside of time and space, uncaused. It's a free agent. It's creative. We may even go so far as to say it's smart, so then it's a person. Well, this sure sounds like what we call God. And so the cosmological argument says things don't just pop into existence. They had to have a cause, and that cause is God. Now, this argument has its flaws. First of all, this argument does not get us to Jesus Christ. It doesn't even get us to Christianity. It just gets us to the possibility that there is something out there, something beyond us, something perhaps divine. Also, philosophers would argue that we don't really understand cause and effect all that well. We can all think of examples when we thought something happened because of a certain cause, but then when we found out more information, we changed our mind. So maybe you could think of a medieval little village that has the plague, and they think that the cause of their problems, this plague, is because God is angry at them, and so they blame witches or something like that. They had the wrong cause. The more information we got, the better we understand what the causes of those diseases were. It's even more complicated than that. When I look at a table, I think that it's static, that is, it's not moving, and if I knock on it, I think that it's solid. But when we get down to the molecular level, we understand that things are always moving and that there's a lot of empty space there. So philosophers, when they are approached with this cosmological argument for the existence of God, sometimes will dismiss it and say, well, we don't really know cause and effect all that well, and so this argument doesn't hold up. But my counter argument to that is, but we're still here, and there's tables in front of us, and I don't really believe that things just pop into existence. And so I think that the cosmological argument for the existence of God has a lot of value. Once again, things that began to exist have causes. You and I began to exist. We have a cause. And in fact, this whole universe is made up of things that began to exist, and they have causes. And as we go back in these string of causes, eventually you got to get to something that was uncaused. Something that caused this thing called the universe. Something outside of time and space. Something that's a free agent and creative. That sure sounds like God to me. Now, we're not yet to Jesus Christ, and there's the beautiful thing about Christianity, that this powerful uncaused cause actually loves us and is willing to forgive us. That's the good news. Let's take some time to think about the cosmological argument. Do you think it's good or bad, valuable or not? I don't think there's a wrong answer on this one. So let's take some time and think about causes and cosmology. Welcome back. I hope that you had a fruitful discussion about the cosmological argument for the existence of God. That was some pretty heady stuff, wasn't it? Our next philosophical argument is called the Anthropological Argument for the existence of God. That's a big fancy word to describe human beings and how they interact in history. Maybe a simpler way to title this argument is to call it the moral argument for the existence of God. It goes like this. If moral, objective standards do not exist, then God does not exist. But moral, objective, absolute standards do exist, therefore God exists. Let me put it a different way. If you or your skeptical friend ever says, that's right or that's wrong, if you've ever looked at the world and say, that's not just, that's evil, if you've ever thought about something as good and beautiful and wonderful and morally pure, then you actually believe in a moral set of standards when it comes to right and wrong, good and evil. And so the question becomes, where did you get that absolute moral objective standard about good and evil and about right and wrong? If you say something's right or wrong, you're appealing to an objective, absolute standard. And where did that come from? Let's imagine that you're going to start a society from scratch. And you're trying to decide, how should we live? What will be our laws? What will be our highest good? And you're going to try to ground that morality and that law on something. You have to build it on some sort of foundation. And there are only three options. Option number one is something below you. Option number two is something on your level. And option number three is something above you. The level below you would be nature. So perhaps you decide to create this society and its morals and its laws based on what you see happening in the world, in nature. And so you look around and you see this is how animals act, and this is how the world is ordered. This is how we're going to order our society. I hope that you already see that this is going to be problematic. When we look at the animal kingdom, we see some beautiful things, but we also see the survival of the fittest. We also see a thinning of the herd. We see things that we human beings would be appalled if we saw in our society. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you have a cat at home, and the cat finds a mouse, and he plays with the mouse, kills the mouse, and then drops the mouse in front of you. You would think that's probably pretty gross, but you wouldn't call the police to throw the cat into kitty prison. You understand that the animal kingdom is driven by instincts. There's predators and there's prey, and there's things that just occur in nature. It's the cycle of life. But if another human being took another human being, played with it, killed it, and dropped it in front of you, you wouldn't think that was gross. You would be horrified by that, and you would be calling the police. And so I don't think we can build a society based largely on what we see in nature, that is, things below us. That would be a pretty nasty and brutish society. So maybe we can build it on our level. And what I mean by grounding morality on our level is that we as a society, right, a group of people that's on my level, we're all above nature, that people on our level can decide what is right and wrong. Perhaps we vote, or we elect officials to write laws, to legislate laws, and we elect judges to adjudicate those laws. That's one way to judge a society, right and wrong, on our level. The other way to create a society with morals on our level is to say that every individual has their own truth, their own right and wrong. I hope you already see that there's going to be problems with this as well. What if one group decides that another group is not worth living? How could we judge that group for that heinous thought when they have made up their own moralities and have voted on it? You really have a problem with moral reformers if you create a society that bases its morality, its right and wrong, only by deciding by vote or elected officials what is eternally right and wrong, objectively an absolute standard. How could a civil rights worker in the 1960s from the North go down to the South in Jim Crow South and tell those people that they're wrong because they're treating people as second-class citizens just because of their color of their skin? You don't really have an opportunity to do moral reform because it's just your society versus my society, or even worse, my morality versus your morality. But what if I'm a murderer? What if I'm even worse? How could you ever judge me? So it seems that grounding our right and wrong, our good and evil, our absolute standards on our level is going to be problematic. In fact, we have a very important historical example of just that. After World War II, the victorious Allies wanted to persecute some of the Nazis in Germany for all the heinous things they did during the war and before the war, in particular, the extermination of Jewish people. Well, technically, the Nazis didn't do anything illegal because they just changed the laws in their society before they carried out those heinous acts. So how can you judge somebody in a courtroom when technically they didn't do anything illegal? And so they came up with this concept, and that is the law above the law. So now we have gotten to something above us. And this was the beginning of what we call international law. But the problem with international law is, who makes up international law? And so what we're all after, what the people who are saying this is unjust in our world, for any person who says that's unfair, for the people who are trying to throw the Nazis into prison, we're all trying to find an absolute standard. And what we're looking for is a reference point that is above us. Think about the sun as a reference point. So maybe you live 100 miles from me and I cannot see you, but in the afternoon, both of us can see the sun if it's a sunny day. What we're looking for is an objective standard of right and wrong that becomes a reference point for all of society, so that we can judge what is right and wrong, what is good and evil. Now, once again, it's not a perfect argument, but this sure sounds like God, this reference point, that we have a law that's written in all of our hearts, no matter what religion a person is, no matter what culture they come from. We have a general sense of right and wrong, that it's always wrong to lie, that it's always wrong to murder. Where did that come from? It seems that a very good answer to that is God. And this is the moral argument for the existence of God. Now, how does maybe a naturalist think about morality? Well, the way they think about morality is through the lens of evolution. And the idea there is that the goal is keeping the species going through the generations. And so that anything that helps us with that survival, ends up being something good. But a true naturalist would never say that there is an actual right or wrong, good or evil. It's just that we give words like good or evil to these evolutionary instincts. But I think you and I don't really like that. We're not buying what they're selling, because you're saying the murderer is not just wrong, he's just bad for society and the continuation of the species. But I think we all understand that it's more than just it's bad for society. It actually is wrong. Let's take a moment now to discuss the moral argument for the existence of God. Welcome back. I hope that you had a good discussion about morals. I personally think that this is the best philosophical argument for the existence of God. And thanks for going through all this philosophy. I know that it was pretty high-level stuff, and you should be proud of yourself for thinking about cosmology and anthropology. Those are pretty big words. But at the same time, it's really simple, isn't it? We're all philosophers. We all ask these questions of how should we live, what is right and wrong, where have I come from, and where am I going, and where do I belong? These worldview type questions. And I think your friends, well, I know that they have a worldview, and their worldview is going to be flawed, just like we all have flawed worldviews. And I think that you can help them say, and help them think, and help them get to the point where you say, but this is right or wrong. Or for instance, how did we even get here in the first place? And I think those are opportunities to talk about God, and specifically a God who loves them. And even though these philosophical arguments for the existence of God didn't get us to Jesus Christ, you can get them to Jesus Christ by saying, but there's good news in all of this, that there is a Creator, and this Creator loves us, that there is a right and wrong, and yet we have a Savior that forgives us when we do what is wrong. I hope that this was beneficial for you, and it gets you thinking a little bit more. And the more you think, the more you'll think about what you would say to your skeptical friend, and maybe when the time is right, you'll be able to put a rock in their shoe.